On Primetime Politics tonight, the somber anniversary of the Montreal Massacre and the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. As the House of Commons marks the day, this gun control advocate pushes for more government action. Canada's ambassador to China, Dominic Barton, steps down. MPs will debate the Canada-China relationship amid growing calls for Canada to follow the U.S. with a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics. And our panel of press gallery journalists on Aaron O'Toole's calls for an investigation into harassment claims against one of his own MPs. And we'll cover more subjects as well. But we'll begin tonight with the marking of a painful anniversary in Canada and the focus on gun control. The Prime Minister and Premier of Quebec were among those at a vigil that was held this evening to remember the victims of the Montreal Massacre 32 years ago today. That's when a gunman opened fire at École Polytechnique, killing 14 women and wounding 10 others. The victims were targeted simply because they were women. In the House of Commons today, MPs observed a minute of silence and spoke about the need for more action to deal with violence against women.
Women being victims of violence simply because they are women should be decreasing, but the evidence shows it's just going up. Since the beginning of the pandemic, the incident of domestic violence has drastically increased. Many women have been victims of violence and abuse. Many have suffered at the hands of an intimate partner. Violence against women in all of its forms tears families apart, and the impact goes beyond the victim, hurting children and our society. Today, as we mark the 32nd anniversary of the École Polytechnique massacre, one of the most horrific examples of gender-based violence, can the Deputy Prime Minister please update this House on what the government is doing to combat violence against women?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, let me thank the Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party for that very important question. And let me just say that while we disagree about many things in this House, I hope that on this very somber anniversary, we can all agree that violence against women is simply unacceptable et que c'est très important aujourd'hui de souvenir les 14 jeunes femmes à Polytechnique de Montréal qui étaient tuées simplement parce qu'elles étaient femmes. Our budget made unprecedented investments in fighting violence against women, and we've just had a moment of silence in this House, but I wonder if people think it would be appropriate, and if you, Mr. Speaker, think it would be appropriate for all the women MPs to rise for one moment now to remember them.
Well, the anniversary of the Montreal Massacre has once again shone the spotlight on the issue of violence against women and the issue of gun control in this country and whether enough's being done to curb gun violence. Heidi Rathjen was in a nearby study room at L'École Polytechnique when 14 women were gunned down in 1989. She went on to form the group Poly Remembers to fight for tighter gun controls, and she's with me now. Heidi Ratchen, first of all, good to see you again. Thanks for taking time to speak with me today. And let's start with, here we are at another anniversary of December 6th of 1989. What are your thoughts as you mark this day and what it represents?
Well, I think for us, I mean, one of the obvious things is the absurdity of this situation where the families of the victims were survivors and witnesses like myself are still 32 years later fighting for tougher gun control. Following the tragedy, in the years following under the Liberal government at the time, under the Chrétien government, we did get strong gun control, and Canada had, reasonable basic controls on par with those in most civilized countries like the European Union. But most of that was destroyed under the Harper government. And unfortunately, even though the Liberal government that came in 2015 got elected on the basis of gun control promises, and re-elected in 2019, nothing substantial has changed on the ground, and gun-related homicide and crime has consistently gone up ever since the first weakening of the laws were passed under the Harper government.
Let's pick up on some of the things you've raised. Your group called for a new Minister of Public Safety to replace Bill Blair. That new minister is Marco Mendicino. What do you want to see from the new minister? What should his priorities be?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to really move quickly on banning assault weapons. This is a measure that was called for in 1989, in the days following the massacre at Polytechnique. We have a theoretical ban on most assault weapons, but because there hasn't been a mandatory buyback program, they're all still out there. And so, I mean, New Zealand did it in 6 months. They banned them and they bought them all back. And according to the Auditor General of the country, it was a success. I think Canada can do the same. And there's no more studies and consultations are needed. We need action now, and we need the government to table their buyback program as soon as possible. We don't know how long the minority government will last, and it would be a real shame if we go into another election with still this measure not implemented.
The minister is still reluctant to impose a national ban on handguns, instead pledging to give that power to ban handguns to provinces. What's wrong with that approach?
Well, first of all, not one province has asked for this measure. There was a motion in the National Assembly, the Quebec National Assembly, but that's not quite the same thing as the government asking for it. And so far, the government has given no indication that they're willing to ban handguns. And that's true for all the other provinces. So basically, offloading this responsibility on the provinces just means that we're starting at zero in 13 jurisdictions instead of continuing to push on the federal government to do what is their jurisdiction. And 7 out of 10 Canadians support a ban on handguns. And we know what happens with these patchwork of laws. All we have to do is look south of the border to see the disaster that results in. And so we're asking for a federal ban. And if we can't have a ban, there are things that the federal government should do as quickly as possible. For example, stem the proliferation, because right now the legal sale of handguns is growing exponentially. Half of the handguns, of the over 1 million handguns that are in private hands today, were sold only in the last 10 years. So that gives an idea of how quickly this market is expanding. And soon we're going to hit a point of no return. So we need to limit the damage to or the risk to what we have now, and see what we can do to reduce those numbers and reverse the trends in terms of handgun violence. And I do have to say that also includes better border controls and crime control in the case of illegal guns.
All right. Heidi Rathjen, thanks again for your perspective this evening. Good to talk to you. Take care. And I know it's a difficult day, as always, this anniversary, but we appreciate you taking a few moments to speak with us.
Thanks for having me.
Canada is looking for a new ambassador to China. Dominic Barton has announced he is stepping down from the post at the end of the month. The former economic growth advisor to the federal government and global economic consultant with McKinsey & Company was handpicked by the Prime Minister for the ambassador's job in 2019. Barton described his work in helping to free 2 detained Canadians in China, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, as the honor of a lifetime. So who should the government tap to replace Dominic Barton? And how should the government approach the relationship with China, with some key decisions pending that could raise tensions even further? One of those decisions, whether to follow the U.S. lead today and announce a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Olympics in February because of China's human rights abuses. Let's bring in 3 members of Parliament to discuss the latest developments. Arif Virani is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. Michael Chong is the Foreign Affairs Critic for the official opposition Conservatives. And Heather McPherson is the foreign affairs critic for the NDP. It's good to see you all. Mr. Virani, let me start with you. The U.S. has now announced a diplomatic boycott of the upcoming Olympics in China. Will Canada follow suit?
Well, thank you, Peter. And we've been notified, obviously, about the American decision, and everything is on the table, is what I can say to you, Peter, is that we are considering our options. We're talking with our allies. We are very concerned with the human rights situation in China with respect to a number of different communities, Xinjiang, the Tibetan community, Hong Kong protesters, etc. All of these factors are going to inform our analysis, but this American decision is an important one because that's one of our key allies, clearly, and having that decision being taken with respect to diplomatic boycott.
Could Canada go, is that the likely route that Canada would take? Could Canada go further? Could Canada tell Olympic athletes not to go to China?
Well, one thing we're conscious of, Peter, is that obviously the role that the athletes can and should play in this process. I mean, these are people that have been dedicated pretty much most of their lives for these games, and they're not meant to be used as pawns for political purposes. I think the diplomatic route that the Americans have taken sort of carves out a difference between not lending credibility to the Chinese regime, but at the same time not jeopardizing the athletes and what they're seeking to achieve.
Mr. Chong, what should Canada's position be relative to the Beijing Olympics? What decision do you think we should take?
Well, we've been calling for a diplomatic boycott for some time, and we think the government should act expeditiously to announce this, make a decision and announce this quickly. Too often, the government is slow in working multilaterally with allies to take a position when it comes to bilateral relations with China. Huawei, for example, is a good example of that. And, the United Kingdom and the United States have already announced that they're going to diplomatically boycott the Games. And it's, once again, Canada is late to the game in making its decision and announcement on this matter.
All right. Heather McPherson, where does the NDP stand on an Olympic boycott, perhaps a diplomatic boycott? The Chinese suggesting today, we don't really care about a diplomatic boycott. None of your diplomats were invited anyway, so no one will notice they're not there. But what do you think what move should Canada make here?
Well, it's similar to Michael. I mean, the NDP have been calling on a diplomatic boycott for some time. Right now we're in a situation where many of our parliamentarians, Michael and myself included, have been banned from China by the Chinese government. How could we have a diplomatic presence there when some of our parliamentarians are not even allowed in the country? So of course we should have. We called on the government to look into moving the Olympics much earlier, because of course now it's too late. Now when I hear the member from the government say, all things are on the table, we don't need all things on the table right now. We need a decision made. We need a decision made, and we need to be able to go forward. We're out of time now. The Olympics are coming in the very, very short future, and the government needs to make a decision and stop just sort of waffling, I guess, on this one.
All right, Mr. Virani, let me move on to the issue of Mr. Barton. He was a pro-trade ambassador. He was interested in trying to increase business dealings with the economic relationship with China, although most of his time was spent trying to free the two Michaels and diffuse an increasingly tense relationship. What's the government looking for in the next ambassador to China, and how quickly will one be appointed?
Well, let me start by just congratulating and thanking Ambassador Barton for his contributions to the diplomatic mission in China and to the tremendous successes he achieved. And in terms of sort of what he was preoccupied with, it was a very complex relationship, and it wasn't just the two Michaels that he succeeded in returning to this country. He obviously took a strong focus on many of the concerns that are taking place with Hong Kong, with Tibetans. He led one of the first missions of a Canadian foreign mission into the Tibetan Autonomous Region in about 6 years to show his own concern about the human rights situation there. In terms of what we're looking for somebody who can understand that this is a very complex and significant relationship. It's a relationship that is challenging for many countries around the planet, and Canada is no exception.
And do you believe that person has to be someone who's got a sort of direct line to the Prime Minister? Is that one of the appointments in terms of Canada's diplomatic corps where this needs to be somebody who's in very, very close relationship to the current government, or can it be someone who's been served a lifetime in the diplomatic corps?
Well, I'm not going to speculate as the specific sort of CV of the ideal candidate, but know that certain postings, Washington, Beijing, those people are important in terms of our foreign policy and will continue to be important. So obviously, their lines of communication, once they are appointed, will be directly into the Prime Minister's
Mr.
office.
Chong, the Liberals appointed former Liberal Minister John McCallum as ambassador to China. That didn't work out, and he was replaced by Dominic Barton, as we know, a close advisor to the Prime Minister. How do you believe the next ambassador to China should be chosen?
Well, we believe that the next ambassador to China should be a diplomat. This government broke with long-standing tradition by making political appointments in China for the ambassadorial position, as well as a political appointment to Japan recently. That's in break with long-standing tradition, where we normally only made political appointments to ambassadorial and high commissioner posts in 3 countries. That was the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. And so we're calling on the government to return to Canada's longstanding tradition of appointing a senior lifelong diplomat to the post. And we think that's important because the government of Beijing is complex and takes a lifetime to understand it. While Mr. Barton came to the job with tremendous private sector credentials.
Let me just
have a diplomatic background.
Can I just jump in for a second? And you can touch on, Heather McPherson can pick up on it. The Chinese often make it clear that they won't accept a diplomat unless that diplomat has a straight line to the Prime Minister, or that ambassador has a straight line to the Prime Minister. Is that a complicating factor here?
Absolutely not. We get to pick our diplomats, full stop. And we should not kowtow to the communist leadership in Beijing and allow them to veto a choice of diplomat to the posting. The 2 recent appointments this government has made to the Beijing post, frankly, have been less than stellar. We've had problems with both of these appointments in the last several years, and I think it's time to return to our longstanding tradition of appointing a senior diplomat who has the experience on the China file.
Heather McPherson, where's the NDP on this?
Obviously, I'd like to echo some of my colleagues thanking Ambassador Barton for the work that he did. Obviously, getting the 2 Michaels out is vital, and we know there are other Canadians. Hussein Salil is still in China, so there is still a lot of work to do. And I think we do need an ambassador who is appointed that does have that diplomatic skill. And I think it's wrong to actually say that somebody that has this ambassador skill wouldn't have the ability to talk directly to the Prime Minister. Surely the Prime Minister recognizes the value of this relationship and could make that happen. I think we need an ambassador that's got that diplomatic credentials that can actually work with a very complex file that will require us to work with our allies around the world.
All right. Need fairly short answers here in the time we have left, but let me quickly, Mr. Virani, ask you, we've been waiting a long time for a decision on Huawei. When are we going to get it?
Well, I think the Huawei decision, among other decisions, is actively under consideration. We are very seized of the matter, and what we're trying to do is evaluate and do everything that will protect Canadians and put their safety as the #1 priority.
All right, Mr. Chong, what are your thoughts on this? Waiting a long time for the Huawei decision.
I think it's an example of this government's unilateral position when it comes to China. The Vice President Biden and President Obama asked Canada not to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Canada did. 4 of our closest intelligence allies have made a decision to restrict or ban Huawei from their networks. Canada is unilaterally alone in not making the decision. And now we have a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Winter Olympics and Paralympics. And the United States and the United Kingdom have made decisions to diplomatically boycott it, but Canada unilaterally is alone and yet to make a decision. So it's part of a broader pattern on part of this.
Okay, the last 30 seconds to you, Heather McPherson. What should the decision be here from Canada?
I have to say that this is part of a continuing incoherent plan around, what our strategy is, what our plan is around China, and decisions need to be made. And when I hear the government members say things like, "Well, we're thinking about it," it's been a long time. A decision needs to be made. There needs to be a more coherent, more stronger plan on how we are going to be working with our allies and how we are going to be working with China.
We'll have to leave it at that tonight. Thank you, all 3 of you, for your time tonight. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll talk again. Take care.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Let's follow up now with our panel of press gallery journalists. Susan Delacourt, a columnist with the Toronto Star, is with us this week. Joël-Denis Bellavance is the parliamentary bureau chief for La Presse, and John Ivison is a columnist with the National Post. Good to see you all. Thanks for being here. Susan, I want to ask you about the departure of Dominic Barton. What do you think of his time as ambassador to China, and what do you think we look for in the next ambassador?
Well, it's funny, only one issue has dominated Dominic Barton's time as ambassador, which he talked about in the interview with the Star, and that was freeing the two Michaels. Mm-hmm. There are tons of other issues going on with China right now, and we've seen that the relationship has to move on to handle some of these things. But I think he will be remembered for his efforts on what he did to do the two Michaels. A note, though, about what the Conservatives were saying today about, he has to be replaced with somebody who's not a friend of the government. China is one of those appointments where the governments often want a friend of the governments. There are some capitals where your closeness to the government in power is seen as an asset. Washington is one of them. Beijing is one. My understanding was that before Dominic Barton was chosen, that China had been signaling to Canada that it would only take seriously somebody who was like a David McNaughton, right, who was the previous ambassador to Washington for the U.S. and very close to the
someone with
government.
A direct line to the Prime Minister.
That's what
right.
I would not be surprised if somebody like that emerges.
John Ivison, what are your thoughts on the next ambassador to China, and what challenges a new ambassador will be facing?
Well, I think that Barton was preoccupied by the two Michaels, but also with boosting trade. And he said he got frustrated in the Star interview. He said he got frustrated with criticism that he was too business focused. He said that I was appointed to help because I knew my way around China, and obviously I'm a businessman. I think it was slightly discordant to be promoting business when the two Michaels were still in jail. And I do think that the government has finally realised that China is not our friend and that we should be behaving as such. I think we're going to see in the next little while a bunch of decisions, including Huawei, including the Winter Olympics, potentially including trade deals, where Canada puts a firm line and makes its position known to the Chinese, and it won't be a position that they like. And I think, former ambassadors, the Conservatives, are all calling for a professional diplomat to be that person. Somebody who can speak firmly to the Chinese in a way perhaps that Barton could not, because he was seen as too friendly toward them.
Joël-Denis, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, the departure of Mr. Barton comes at a very critical moment. Yes, he can say mission accomplished for getting the two Michaels out, but the Canadian government is being pressured to boycott diplomatically the Winter Olympics. So if we do that without appointing an ambassador, the channel of communications might be disrupted even before we appoint a new ambassador. And I agree with Susan that this is a political appointment in the same matter as Washington, in the same matter as is in Great Britain and in Paris. And by the way, the Paris ambassadorship is still vacant since last June. So we have a few posts to fill in our ambassador abroad. Paris is one of them. China will be vacant by the end of December, and Saudi Arabia is one of them, in Iraq. So, and in the speech from the throne, I would remind you that the government let it know that it wanted to increase its number of ambassadors abroad, namely in the Arctic region and Indo-Pacific region. So we have a few posts empty, a few positions vacant, and we want to increase the number of ambassadors. So a lot of work for the new foreign affairs ministers.
Peter, can I
jump in, John? Go ahead.
Can I pick up on what JD was saying? I mean, I recognise that Barton and John McCallum were both political appointments, but prior to that, China was not an embassy that had political appointments in the way that Washington has quite usually had, and London and Paris as well. The other thing is that, to back up my point about the Winter Olympics and Barton, he said in the Star interview that we should think very carefully about a diplomatic boycott. It's a very symbolic thing because the Chinese say we haven't invited any of your diplomats.
Right, and no one will notice if you're not there anyway.
So nobody will notice. But it's just a snub. And Barton clearly is not on side with that with that strategy, and it does look like that's the way we're going.
Susan, let me pivot on this if I can to something else. Aaron O'Toole wants the House of Commons to investigate claims by some former employees of a Conservative MP from Alberta, Shannon Stubbs, that she misused office staff to paint her house, and they filed some complaints of harassment, alleged some complaints of harassment against her. Shannon Stubbs has been vocal in calling for an early review of Aaron O'Toole's leadership, and now this. She claims it's retaliation from Aaron O'Toole. What do you think is happening here?
It's hard not to make that connection. On the heels of, or even before the Globe and Mail story hit the headlines, Shannon Stubbs was being asked to be investigated, and she has been one of the more vocal ones too. It tells us if there is a link. And, I don't know that for a fact. But if there is a link, it does tell us that O'Toole is playing hardball with his critics. We already saw this when he appointed his shadow cabinet. It looks like he is doing whatever he can to take control. And I'm finding it hard to separate this story, which has, as you mentioned, the interesting details about painting her bedroom, which she did say was a surprise gift for her. It's still not right, by the way. But yeah.
John, how do you see this? Aaron O'Toole is suggesting today, look, I just learned about these detailed allegations last week, and I've referred to the House of Commons because we want to show that we take any of these allegations of workplace harassment seriously. What do you think's happening here?
I think it was a bad decision on O'Toole's part. It looks petty. I'm pretty sure it is petty. And we've seen him behave in a petty fashion before. Peter MacKay was keen to run in the Central Nova seat. He was essentially told, or people close to him were told, that ain't happening, we don't want him, which seems crazy because MacKay could have picked up Central Nova, or he could certainly have helped the Conservatives in Nova Scotia. But there was almost an insecurity there from O'Toole's part about having MacKay inside the tent. And I think similar fashion here. To me, O'Toole has essentially seen off his critics. There cannot be a leadership review until August 2023, and I think by then the caucus will be very loath to throw overboard their leader just before an election. So this is just going to generate sympathy for the people who've been criticising him, in my opinion.
All right, Joël-Denis, how do you see it?
Well, Madame Stubbs is a quite popular MP in her region. I've traveled in her riding in 2019 before the federal elections, and my gosh, she was very popular with the people over there. So Mr. O'Toole may try to silence one of her critics, but it may transform her into a political martyr and make her very, very popular within the more hard right ranks in the Conservative Party. So he has to play very carefully his strategy, otherwise it might backfire on him.
All right, we'll continue to see where that story goes. That's our time. Thank you all for joining me tonight. Good to see you all again. Everybody take care. We'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of Primetime Politics on CPAC. I'm Peter Van Dusen from all of us here at CPAC. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.